New
No running water,
podcast,
no
Rohingya
concrete,
genocide,
and it
copyright
happens to be
Mohammed
sitting
Raj
directly on
Abdullah.
top of an ancient Asian elephant migration path.
Which is just a recipe for absolute disaster.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. We have a very specific, honestly pretty heavy mission today. We are going to unpack a complex, ongoing humanitarian crisis that, frequently just gets buried under other global headlines. We're talking about the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar.
Right. And to really do this justice, we're relying on a brilliantly comprehensive video essay from the channel Into the Shadows.
Yeah, it's an incredible source.
It really is. They break down the history, the atrocities, and just the truly staggering current reality of the Rohingya people. And when you mentioned that bamboo city, I mean, we were talking about nearly 600,000 people living in the world's largest refugee camp right now.
And they are completely stripped of a state, like totally stateless.
Yeah. And to understand how an entire ethnicity arrives at that point of total statelessness, you have to look way past the modern news cycle.
Right. You can't just look at yesterday's headline.
No, not at all. You have to look at the mechanics of how borders were drawn and, well, more importantly, how people were classified within those borders centuries ago.
So let's actually start there. Because the Myanmar government today, they routinely refer to the Rohingya people as, quote, illegal migrants.
Right.
But the source material shows that to understand that label, we have to trace the shifting borders of the 18th and 19th centuries. So the Rohingya are an Indo-Aryan ethnic group, historically practicing Islam, and for centuries, their home was the Arakan Kingdom.
Which, just for geographic context for you listening, that maps roughly to the modern-day Rakhine state in Myanmar.
Yeah. And it's crucial to understand what the Arakan Kingdom actually was.
Yeah.
Right? Like, for a long time, it functioned as a vassal state.
Meaning they paid tribute to bigger empires to basically just be left alone?
Exactly. They paid the bully to not beat them up. So they largely managed their own affairs. They maintained their own distinct culture, had their own societal structures.
But that autonomy was violently shattered, right? Like in the 1780s.
Yes, 1780s. The Third Burmese Empire invaded Arakan. And they didn't just conquer it, they systematically dismantled the society.
Just took it apart completely.
Yeah, they deported the able-bodied men back to Burma to be used as slave labor, and they slaughtered anyone they couldn't find an immediate use for.
Which naturally triggers a massive exodus. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya fled west into Bengal.
And at the time, Bengal was territory held by the East India Company.
Right, which eventually becomes British India.
Right, so these refugees, they settle there, they integrate, they find work, and they live there for, what, about a century?
Yeah, roughly 100 years, but then the British Empire decides, well, it's time to expand and conquer Burma, too.
Because of course they did.
Right. And when British colonial administrators finally arrived in the Arakan region after conquering Burma, they found a landscape that was still relatively empty.
Because it had never fully repopulated after that brutal Burmese invasion 100 years prior.
Exactly. So the British, they look at this highly fertile, unworked land, and to an empire, unworked land is just lost revenue.
That's a blank spreadsheet to them.
Totally. So they aggressively incentivize citizens of British India to move into Arakan to farm it.
And actually, a massive portion of the people who took the British up on that offer were the direct descendants of the Rohingya who had been violently expelled from that exact same land a few generations earlier.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's essentially like a massive colonial-level landlord dynamic. The British are shuffling tenants between two buildings they own, but eventually those buildings are going to be sold off to different owners, leaving the tenants to fight a bloody battle over who actually has the right to live in the apartment.
That's a really good way to put it. The problem with the British administrative perspective is that it treated human beings purely as logistical assets, just numbers on a page.
Right, moving labor from point A to point B.
Exactly. They viewed this strictly as internal migration within the same empire. But the local Burmese population, they didn't see a spreadsheet.
No, they saw their territory being flooded by waves of people they considered foreigners and colonizers.
Right, completely ignoring the fact that many of these so-called foreigners had historical roots in that very soil.
So you have this intense tension baking into the region for decades. How does that colonial friction harden into the legal framework for modern ethnic cleansing? Because after World War II, the British Empire fractures, and Burma finally secures its independence in 1948.
And almost immediately upon independence, the promises made by the departing British just they evaporate.
Goof, gone.
Yeah. The Urkhan region was denied the autonomy it had been promised. The Rohingya living there recognized the writing on the wall, and they desperately wanted to join neighboring East Pakistan.
Which was a Muslim-majority area that would later become Bangladesh.
Right. But the new Buddhist-majority Burmese government vetoed that proposal entirely.
And they didn't just stop at a veto. They explicitly labeled the Rohingya as illegal migrants occupying stolen land.
Which is wild when you consider the history.
It really is. And during the Japanese invasion in World War II, many Rohingya had temporarily fled back to India for safety. When they tried to return after the war, the new Burmese government they denied them border entry.
They just seized the land and property they had left behind.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the structural squeeze. By 1962, General Nguyen's socialist military junta seized power, and they escalated this from societal prejudice to systematic state policy.
Right, they purged the Rohingya from public life entirely.
Stripped them of political offices, expelled them from the military regardless of their service records, outlawed their cultural organizations.
Which all culminates in 1978 with a military campaign chillingly named Operation Dragon King.
Operation Dragon King. That sounds like a movie villain plot.
It does, but it was horrifyingly real. The state's official line was that they were just clearing out foreigners ahead of a national census.
Right, just a census.
But in reality, it was a campaign of absolute terror. They used intimidation, murder, and sexual violence, which forced roughly 250,000 Rohingya to flee across the border into Bangladesh.
And many of those refugees eventually came back to Myanmar following a UN repatriation deal, right?
They did. But they were walking blindly into a devastating legislative trap. Because in 1982, the military junta instituted a new citizenship law.
Okay, this is the pivotal moment.
Yeah. They created a definitive list of the national races of Burma, and the Rohingya were intentionally left off that list.
And the criteria for making that list is where the true absurdity of this bureaucracy just completely reveals itself.
Yeah.
The military based their definition of who belonged on an archaic British colonial survey from 1823.
Wait, 1823?
Yeah.
1824?
That's 160 years before the law.
Yeah.
The selection of 1823 was highly calculated, obviously.
Extremely, because it was the year right before the First Anglo-Burmese War. Which means it predated the British bringing over that massive wave of labor from India.
Exactly. The 1982 law basically dictated that any individual who couldn't definitively trace their bloodline back to one of the groups listed in that specific 1823 survey instantly had their citizenship revoked.
Just think about the logistical nightmare of that. How does a government realistically enforce a 160-year-old survey on a largely rural agrarian population?
You can't.
Right.
Yeah.
You're asking farmers in remote villages to produce century-old genealogical paperwork just to prove they have the right to exist.
And they enforce it by making daily life impossible. I mean, without citizenship, your existence becomes an administrative error.
You're an alien in your own home.
Exactly. You can't legally travel to the next town to sell your crops. You can't legally register a marriage. You can't get a government job or access state health care.
It's a surgical strike disguised as a historical survey.
By legally declaring them stateless aliens, the government removed the protective layer of basic human rights, meaning whatever happened to them next wasn't technically a crime against a citizen.
Wow. But a law on paper is just ink, right? To get a society to turn a blind eye or to actively participate in violence against their neighbors, you need a social catalyst.
You have to convince the public that their own survival is at stake.
Right. And according to the source material, the origin of that radicalization is what truly shocked me. This wasn't just military propaganda. It was spearheaded by Buddhist monks.
Wait, stop there. Because I think most people globally associate Buddhist monks with absolute pacifism.
Oh, totally.
You know, meditation, the Dalai Lama, nonviolence.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go from that to monks leading violent mobs? What is the ideological bridge there?
It is a profound contradiction to the Western perception of Buddhism, for sure. But religious nationalism operates on the exact same machinery everywhere.
Okay, how so?
Well, if a religious leader convinces their followers that their faith and their very culture are facing an existential threat of extinction, the tenets of pacifism are quickly discarded for self-defense.
Ah, so it's framed as survival.
Exactly. By the 1990s and early 2000s, this narrative really took hold. In 1997, during the Mandalay riots, over 1,500 Buddhist monks marched through the streets shouting anti-Muslim slogans.
Just openly marching.
Yeah. They destroyed 18 mosques, burned Qurans, and vandalized businesses. And the military junta didn't intervene at all. They simply watched.
And then the propaganda gets a massive, unexpected boost from an event happening literally thousands of miles away.
Right, in Afghanistan.
Yeah. In the early 2000s, the Taliban destroyed the ancient Buddhist